Good evening, everyone. We're talking about the portion of Boy, which is another portion that talks about the Exodus. In fact, last week we had 7 of the plagues, which we reenact on the Pesach Seder. And tonight we are dealing with this week's portion, which deals with the last 3. Let's go through a summary of the reading and then come back to deal with some of the things that we could glean practical messages for in life. It begins with the 8th plague. We had 7 last week. The 8th plague, Moshe and Aaron told Pharaoh that a plague of locusts would attack Egypt if he doesn't free Bnei Israel. Pharaoh's servants begged him, just let them go, to allow the Jewish people to leave. Pharaoh agrees to free Bnei Israel, provided that their children remain as security. He wants to make sure they're coming back. He doesn't want to lose his slaves. Moshe and Aaron refused this. It's a very famous verse, we'll go with our elders, with our young, all in sundry, nobody's going to be left behind. This is about our entire people Israel going. Once Moshe and Aaron refused to leave the children behind, locusts arrived, they consumed all of the crops of Egypt. Pharaoh asked Moshe Rabbeinu to pray for the removal of the locusts. He promises, okay, we'll let the Jewish people and their children and everything can go, free. Like the entire people and all their possessions can go. So a wind carries the locusts back to the Red Sea, and Pharaoh breathes a sign of relief. But once again, he's a very tragic figure. Again, he changes his mind. So the penultimate plague comes, the 9th plague. All the Egyptians were incapacitated by debilitating pitch darkness. Does this sound familiar? So this is load shedding, but extreme. Not only they couldn't see anything, the thickness of the darkness didn't even allow them to move. They actually physically, tangibly felt the thickness of the darkness. Pharaoh offers to release Bnei Israel if they left their cattle behind. Still bargaining. He's a tough nut to crack. So he said, okay, so you can take the elders, take the children, just leave the cattle behind. Moshe refuses again, and Pharaoh warned Moshe, on the day that you see my face again, you shall die. You'll never see my face again. So this was a bit of a prophecy on the part of Pharaoh. It was true. This was the end of Egypt. Moshe said that after the 10th plague, Pharaoh would drive Bnei Israel from his land. He would not only beg them to leave, he would push them. Hashem told Moshe to instruct Bnei Israel to borrow wealth from the Egyptian neighbors. Moshe warns Pharaoh that every firstborn in the land of Egypt will die. Hashem gives Bnei Israel their first mitzvah. We put in a bit of a brackets over here. Very important that the Jewish people were involved. They themselves were now involved in the process of the Exodus. And what was the first mitzvah? To announce Rosh Chodesh and to establish a lunar calendar, which we'll discuss a bit. Hashem told Moshe to instruct Bnei Israel to designate a lamb for the Paschal offering and to eat it together with matzah and maror on the eve of the 15th of Pesach of Nisan. This was the first Pesach in the history of the world. The blood of the lamb was to be put onto the lintels of the doorposts. All inside of those homes would be spared when God descended to smite the Egyptian firstborn. So until now, God himself differentiated between the Jewish home and the Egyptian home. So the blood only affected the Egyptian, not the Jews. The frogs affected the Egyptians, not the Jews. This was the first time that the Jews had to play an active part in differentiating between their home and the homes of the Egyptians. And as a result of the act of the Jewish people putting the blood of the Paschal offering on their homes, that is how they were saved. In future generations, on this day, Pesach would begin, no chametz would be eaten or possessed. So we have this little interlude in the midst of all the unfolding history story of the demise of Egypt, that we would have Pesach then, and we would have Pesach in subsequent years. And then Plague 10 arrives. God slew all the Egyptian firstborn at midnight, and a great outcry erupted. Pharaoh awoke and begged Moshe to take Bnei Israel and leave as soon as possible. equipped with the Egyptians' valuables, provisions for the way dough that was baked before having even time to rise, thus the invention of the new Jewish bread called matzah. And Israel left Egypt at midday on the 15th of Nisan. More details pertaining to the Paschal offering are detailed. Hashem gave the Israelites several mitzvahs. So we're actually given a number of our mitzvahs then, just before we left Egypt. Although the mitzvahs were going to be given at Sinai, and revelation was going to add a dimension to all the mitzvahs that was never the case prior, but we actually were officially introduced to a number of mitzvahs, i.e., the male Israelite firstborn were henceforth to be sanctified to Hashem. In fact, in that first generation, initially, the Kohanim, the priests, were not a tribe, they were the firstborn of every family. Secondly, they would eat matzah on Pesach. Thirdly, they would recount the story of the Exodus at the Pesach Seder, which we do every year. Fourthly, they'd bring all male firstborn of kosher animals as sacrifices. Fifthly, they would redeem all male firstborn donkeys for a sheep, because a donkey cannot be brought as a sacrifice. They would redeem it on a sheep, which was then given to the Kohen. And finally, to put on tefillin on our head and our arm, one of the 4 times that we are introduced to the mitzvah of tefillin was then as we were leaving Egypt. Moving on to some of the life messages that we can derive from all of this, just a thought. It's actually a personal thought about the last 3 plagues. Nothing is by coincidence. What's the grouping of these last 3 plagues, and what do they represent beyond the events that happen in Egypt that relate to our world today? Well, locust represents greed. Locusts arrive and they devour everything that they see. They leave nothing. There's no thought about it tomorrow. It's a cloud of darkness that descends, locusts, and they just chew and eat everything in their place. It represents the unfortunate midah, characteristic of greed, which happens in society today as well. People utilize things without thinking of tomorrow. There's a greed that allows us to destroy our planet, not to think about the importance of the world being green tomorrow as well, not to uproot and destroy everything, as the Torah tells us. You can eat of the fruit, but don't chop the tree down. And we are, unfortunately, in our world today, so involved with greed. But what's the result of greed? The result of greed is that we no longer are able to see one another's needs, because we are so involved in utilizing everything of this world for our own benefit. We're no longer able to see and be compassionate about the needs of others. So darkness results from greed. Darkness that doesn't allow one human being to consider the plight of others, because it's all about my greed. I don't care about anybody else's problems. And that darkness, which we're going to soon see in the various commentaries, becomes not only a darkness that you can't see, it becomes debilitating. Eventually they could not move. You become incapacitated. And when a world is filled with greed and lack of compassion and ability to see the needs of anyone else, what results is a society of violence. The death of the firstborn, which represents violence. People don't think about the validity and the value of life, of human life. Because if we're so filled with greed, and we no longer see the needs of others, then we plunder to the point that we're not even concerned about the value of human life. Those are the last 3 plagues that happened then, and they happen in our world today as well. Most tragic figure is this Paro, and a very ironic point that the whole context is about slavery, is about the Jewish people being enslaved, and they have to be redeemed, and they are taken out of Egypt. But in fact, the greatest tragedy of slavery is this man Paro himself. And he teaches us that slavery doesn't only come in chains that are put around our arms and hands and feet, God forbid, and that we are put in a jail. The slavery can be in our own inability to escape our own mindsets, our own emotions, We're stuck in our own tragic personalities and unable to change. And Paro keeps saying, I will let the Jewish people go free. After this destruction to my land, yes, they can go. And as soon as it comes to the moment, can't. He cannot let go of where he was in the past. And that's a Paro that is within each of us. God forbid people become addicted, they become stuck. And if it's not an addiction to a substance abuse, God forbid, it's also we're addicted to our own emotions. We struggle to change. We have faribbles, we have frustrations, we have anger, we are jealous, we have hatred, and we just can't let go. We become prisoners of our own making. So ironically, we actually see that we're talking about a people enslaved by Paro, but the most tragic figure of all the people at that time was Paro as a slave to his own emotions, unable to make changes in his life. Failed resolutions. So that reminds us that when we talk about freedom from slavery, it's not only saying let somebody make sure that there's no door shut and that we have the capacity to move freely and to do the things we want to do. We should not be slaves of our own making, meaning we should look through our lives and think about all the things that make us be stuck, inescapably stuck. And that is a slavery. Sometimes the self-imposed slavery is the hardest to redeem ourselves from, because even if circumstances change, we're stuck. And that's in Kabbalistic terms, in mystical teachings, it talks about the 3 restrictions of Paro, and very often in Kabbalah it uses the human anatomy to depict what is taking place. And in our throats, our neck, which is a restricted area between the head and the rest of our body, very important pipeways are there. Kana, voishas, uvrid. We have an air pipe, we have a food pipe, and we have a bloodline. 3 essential pipes that are needed to be open to the rest of the body. But look how even the anatomy, it's a restriction. There's the head, and then it restricts into the narrow passage of the neck, and then it opens up to the rest of the body. And so often that represents the blockage that exists between a human mindset, the way we think, and the way we feel and act, which is completely removed from philosophical thoughts that we have. We know what's right, but we can't affect it. The actual anatomy of the body shows how everything from the head and the brain to pass through to the rest of the body goes through the shleisha, the gimel, sare, pare, the 3 restrictions of the neck. So in the physical body, that's fine. That's how we function. The blood and the air and the food is able to get from our heads to the rest of our body. But it's indicative of the fact that we have to open up to ensure that the way we think, the mind that is leading us, is able to impact on our heart and on our actions, that we're not stuck, that we can actually extricate ourselves from the way we were yesterday and the day before and last year. We have a capacity to grow. We said that this verse is a very famous verse. B'na'oreinu u'vizkeneinu nelech, b'voneinu u'vivnoseinu ki chag Hashem lanu. Moshe Rabbeinu answered Paro when he said, okay, you can go, just don't push too far. You can go, the adults can go, and I'll keep the young people back as collateral to make sure that the old people are ultimately also tied up to Egypt. And Moshe Rabbeinu says, no, you got the wrong message. The Jewish journey is not about old people coming to shul. The Jewish journey is b'noreinu v'izkaneinu, with our young and with our old, with our sons and with our daughters. This is a celebration of our people, and our people need young and old, all and sundry. Because Paro knew, says the Mayana Shel Torah, that as long as the young generation remain in Egypt, in inverted commas, stuck in a different world, there'd be no future for the people of Israel. And the pharaohs of our day have the same attitude. If the older folk wish to cling to Jewish tradition, okay, so fine, so the old people go to shul and they'll do a few mitzvahs. But the youth should be raised in the spirit of the times, and they should be part and parcel of a world that is foreign to Israel, to Judaism, to our value system. And God forbid sometimes we allow that to happen. I keep referring to a book that it has been completed, but it's still going through the final finishing touches, cover, design, all those kind of things. But in it, there's a letter from my father who spent a short amount of time in Bethlehem after being in Warmbads and then subsequently moved back to Warmbads. The days in Bethlehem were very short-lived for a number of reasons, which are in the book. But in a letter that he wrote from that time, he decried the fact that he was trying to get cheder lessons, trying to get kids to come to learn Torah, but parents are sending off their kids, maybe to grade college, I don't know where it was, but to the main city, from Bethlehem to Bloemfontein, and that they were sending their kids to be boarders in schools that obviously had no Torah, but that had completely foreign religious and cultural and values that were foreign to the Jewish people. And in a letter, it's interesting that he was pouring out his heart. He was saying in Russia, the Russian regime came and took away children to join the army for 25 years. They were known as the Kantonisten. It was the greatest threat and fear of a parent that their child would be snatched by the Bolsheviks to go and serve in the army for 25 years. You could only imagine what would happen to such a child if they survived physically. Certainly, how would they survive Jewishly? And here, said my father, there are parents that are actually willingly paying to send their kids into a foreign environment for other people to raise their children. What are the chances of these kids ever really being connected to their Judaism? Moshe Rabbeinu said, for Judaism to survive, it has to be binoreinu v'zkanenu, with our young and old, with our sons and with our daughters. It is an all-encompassing, all and sundry experience. We can't, God forbid, sacrifice our children to foreign cultures with foreign priorities. And today, even Jewish education is not so necessarily guaranteed as it was in South Africa for so many years. And people are choosing to take the kids out of a Jewish school into a non-Jewish school for supposedly having more cultural activities and an even better matric than you can get in the Jewish schools. The Jewish schools did so well. But not realizing that they're sacrificing the children's Yiddishkeit. What are the chances of these kids being inspired to continue with Judaism if the parents are not even feeling it important to send their kids to a Jewish school? Okay, I've got it all off my chest, so we're going to carry on. There's an interesting midrash that says, Paro said to Moshe Rabbeinu, he warned him, he said, you're entering into dangerous territory. You want to take the Jewish people into the desert? My astrological art, I can see that there's a star of evil, Ra'ah, ki Ra'ah neged nechem. The word is Ra'ah, rising towards you in the wilderness. It is a sign of blood and slaughter. So Paro said, I actually have all of these abilities to see beyond the obvious and beyond the physical world. I can see through my powers that transcend the physical world. Sorcery, witchcraft. I can see that there's blood waiting for the Jewish people. And Israel worshipped the golden calf, and God threatened to slay them. So Paro actually had a vision of possible death to the Jewish people, blood to the Jewish people, because unfortunately things unfolded in the desert, not as God wanted it to be, and the Jewish people sinned. And we danced around the golden calf, and God was ready to destroy us. The blood that Paro saw was real. And Moshe davened, and he said, how can you allow the Egyptians to speak and say, and he uses the same word, ra'ah, in evil, that you, God, took the Jewish people out of Egypt to then perish, to be destroyed by you, God, in the desert. This is exactly what Paro will say, or the people of Paro, the continuation of Paro will say, look, we foretold it. The Jewish people were destroyed by God. And God listened to Moshe Rabbeinu's prayer, and he changed the blood of which this star was an emblem, from the blood of destruction into the blood of circumcision. So there was blood, but the blood was not the blood of death, but the blood of circumcision. And when Joshua circumcised the people of Israel when they entered the Holy Land, Again, he used that word, ra'ah. This day I have removed you from the reproach of the Egyptian, that which the Egyptian said to you, we see blood impending over you in the wilderness. This day that we circumcise our children, we are able to take you out of that hold, that God forbid possibility of death, which Paro foresaw, but didn't see it so well, because the blood turned out to be not the blood of death, but the blood of the covenant of circumcision. So Hashem turns a very strong west wind, which took away the locusts and cast them into the Sea of the Reeds, which is what we actually call it the Red Sea. You might wonder, what's the origin of the name the Red Sea? It's definitely not red. It actually comes from the Reed Sea, because there were so many reeds there. And I don't know how it became from reed to red. And there will remain not one locust in all the borders of Egypt. Why does the Midrash says, why was it so important to mention that not even one locust remained? Because when the locusts first came, the Egyptians didn't understand what was going on. They started rejoicing. They said, oh, thank God the locusts have arrived. That's food. They ate the locusts. They thought this was the greatest windfall profit that they ever had, that locusts were coming to Egypt. Let's gather them and fill barrels with them, and we'll store them. For many years ahead, we'll have all these locusts to eat. So did God say, wretches, will you rejoice with the plagues I've brought upon you? Immediately God said, I'll turn a very strong west wind, and there remain not one locust in all the borders of Egypt. You think it's a blessing. They will eat everything, and then they will leave. And you won't have the benefit of even one of them. Don't think this is food, this is punishment. Even those that had not been picked in their pots and barrels took wing and fled. Sometimes we look at our galut and we think that we have wonderful benefits. We actually think that we are blessed with being in exile. Sometimes in South Africa, we can get carried away with ourselves, load shedding aside and other issues aside. When we're sitting at our pool on Sunday afternoon with a braai, sometimes we can get so carried away with ourselves that we think that this is actually heaven. We need to remember that being outside of Israel and not being redeemed and not being in where we're supposed to be is, God forbid, not home to the Jewish people. So Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu, stretch out your hand towards the heaven, and there will be darkness over the land of Israel. Hashem brought darkness upon the Egyptians. There were transgressors of Israel who lived in affluence and honor and were unwilling to leave. This is a midrash. Elsewhere, Rashi actually says it was 4/5 of the Jewish people. That the multitudes of 600,000 that left was actually only 4/5 of the Jewish people, is another midrash to say. Meaning that there were Jewish people who said, we actually want to stay in Egypt. And God said, if I bring upon them publicly a plague from which they will die, those 4/5 that didn't want to leave, the Egyptians will say, just as it passed over us, so it passed after them. It has nothing to do with Egypt. This has to do with God indiscriminately killing people. So therefore Hashem brought about darkness, says the Midrash, so that the Egyptians would not be able to see for 3 days, so that the Israelites would be able to bury their dead, tragically just moments away from redemption. They were able to bury their dead without the enemies seeing them. So the darkness proved to be a terrible, horrific punishment for the Egyptians. It also gave the Jewish people the cover of darkness to be able to bury their dead who tragically did not want to leave Egypt. Now we've got another midrash that says that during the darkness, there were 6 days of darkness. In the first 3 days, man did not see his fellow. During the last 3 days, one who was sitting could not even stand up. The darkness became so pervasive that it became thick and debilitating, and a person couldn't even move, let alone see. One who was standing could not sit down, and one who was lying down could not raise himself, who were actually now, the Egyptians, overwhelmed by the darkness, could not even move. That's what the Midrash says. The Chidush Harim, who is the Gerer Rebbe, who gives such beautiful interpretations in Torah, he said there's no greater darkness than one in which a man does not see his fellow. In English, we say there's none so blind as those who choose not to see, but particularly when it comes to seeing the plight of others. So there's no greater darkness in a situation where man does not see his fellow, in which a person becomes oblivious to the needs of his fellow man. When we become blind to the needs of others, when that happens, a person eventually becomes stymied in his personal development as well. Nor did anyone get up from his place. The Chiddush Harim says this is an actual natural consequence. When we don't see the needs of others, what kind of life do we have? Our life becomes so shrunken, so debilitated, so stymied, that we can't even move. We can't even accomplish anything in our own life because we're missing the ingredient of being able to see the needs of others. So there's a very symbolic interpretation of the darkness that the Egyptians endured, first initially not being able to see, and then not even being able to move. We learn from this that when we're unable, or we choose not to see the needs of others, our own lives become totally insignificant. And I've often mentioned the Gemara that tells us that Rabbi Zera lived to very old age. He had longevity. He was blessed with many years. And the Gemara says, how did Rabbi Zera have this special blessing to live so long? The Gemara says, because he never rejoiced in the misfortune of another human being. And this Gemara is very difficult to understand. Are we saying that Rabbi Zera was blessed with longevity because he never rejoiced in the misfortune of somebody else? Is that what we would think of Rabbi Zera? That somebody else is unfortunately walking down the road, slips, and does a triple somersault backwards and lands on his head, which would normally be funny? No, Rabbi Zera didn't see it as funny. He never rejoiced when somebody else had misfortune. Is that what we're saying? How could we even think of even any human being rejoicing in somebody else's misfortune? So why would the Gemara say that was the reason that Rabbi Zera lived long? Because he never rejoiced in somebody else's misfortune. And the explanation of that Gemara, which is so beautifully saying, no, it's not saying that Rabbi Zera didn't rejoice that somebody else had misfortune. Rabbi Zera didn't rejoice in his own life when he had a wedding in his family, when he had a bar mitzvah in his family, when he had a windfall profit and he was now able to rejoice in whatever happened in his own life. He could never rejoice fully because of the misfortune of somebody else. Even when his own world was dancing, he could not rejoice properly because he was always thinking about, what about somebody else? What about the next person who's in need? And his life revolved about satisfying the needs of everyone, not just himself. So he lived long because of this tremendous bracha, because he never rejoiced in the misfortune of somebody else. Not that he didn't rejoice that they were having misfortune. He didn't rejoice in his own life because somebody else was having misfortune. Beautiful, deeper interpretation in how to look at our lives and how to see the needs of others in a really meaningful way. Now the Gemara in Bracha says that as they were leaving, Hashem said to Moshe Rabbeinu, please speak to the ears of the people, tell the Jewish people that every man must ask his neighbor and every woman her neighbor articles of silver and gold. So Hashem gave an instruction to the Jewish people that we should go and take the wealth of Egypt with us when we left Egypt. So the Gemara in Bracha says, to what is this comparable? To a man is locked up in a prison and he's told, tomorrow you're going to be freed from prison and given a lot of money. What would the person who's in prison say? I beg you, let me go free today. I ask for nothing more. Why are you even mentioning wealth? I am suffering in exile. I am a slave. Don't tell me that tomorrow I'm going to leave with lots of wealth. I just want to be free. I don't need wealth. Why would wealth and gold and silver even be something mentioned to the Jewish people as they suffered the servitude that they suffered? And the Gemara carries on and says, God pleaded that even though that was the last thing on their minds, that they asked the Egyptians for gold and silver to fulfill the promise to Abraham that Hashem had made many years before when he told Abraham, your children will be slaves in Egypt. But after that, I will redeem them. B'rechush gadol, with great wealth. They're going to leave Egypt with tremendous amount of wealth. I promised that to Abraham. Don't let that promise fall by the wayside, I plead with you, even though that might not be on your mind as a slave, to even be thinking about wealth. I'm asking you, don't go and ask the Egyptians for their wealth and they'll give it to you, so that when you leave as rich people, as I promised Abraham would be the case. And what does this mean on a deeper level? What does it mean to leave Egypt with wealth? Fine, so he promised Abraham Avinu, so he has to fulfill the promise, and the Jewish people have to go out with wealth. But what does it mean as a instruction, as a message to all of us, that when we're in slavery, we should be having our minds to thinking about wealth? No. What's the deeper message that it's telling us? Why was the Egyptian wealth an indispensable component of our redemption? Why? In addition to the fact that Hashem promised Abraham, but why did he promise that to Abraham? What was the need of wealth accompanying redemption? So every creation contains a spark of holiness. This embodies its divine purpose. When a person utilizes an object, force, or phenomenon for good, we redeem and elevate the divine sparks at its core. These are called in Kabbalistic terms nitzotzos, sparks of heaven, of godliness that are found in our physical world. And every time we use something of this physical world for a positive purpose, when we use money to give tzedakah, we redeem the hidden sparks of opportunity in that physical item. We redeem it so that it can be elevated to holiness. And a soul is only complete when it redeems those sparks which belongs to its personal mission in life. So when does a soul fulfill its mission in this world? When it has encountered enough sparks and redeemed them to return that which is captured in a physical world that is of holy potential, and returned it to the holiness. By using money, physical things, leather for straps for tefillin, and candles for lighting candle, and food for eating kosher and for Shabbos, and for all the things that we do good with physical matter, we redeem the sparks that's within it. In all forms of galut, divine providence guides us, each of us, to our individual possessions and opportunities to elevate our personal sparks. 202, say the Hasidic masters, of the 288 sparks, the grand total of sparks to be redeemed, 288. 202 of them were taken out of Egypt. They were redeemed and elevated when the Jewish people carried off the gold and silver and used them to construct the sanctuary for Hashem in the desert. And what remained only was another 86 that have to be redeemed throughout the eternity of time. But what's the message? The message is that God took us into slavery and to a terrible existence, and 210 years of real slavery. More years being separated from the Holy Land in Egypt. The purpose cannot just be that we emerge from there and that we're unscathed, or that we're unhurt, and that we are able to survive, and we are survivors coming out of a bad situation, and that's the reason that God put us in Galus. No. We have a mission to fulfill. And there in Egypt, in the darkest place of the world, where the immoral code was decadent and absent, and there was nothing that was of value. But the Jewish people being there came into contact with Egypt. And the taking of the physical wealth, the gold and silver, and all of the possessions, to go and build a sanctuary, to build a house for God in the desert, was symbolic of saying that if we're emerging from such a darkness, from such pain, from such suffering, we have enriched the world by having redeemed good that lay buried deep inside of Egypt. Physical wealth, but the spiritual wealth. And what it tells us, a message that we've said many times, when we go through a dark moment in our lives, when there's a period that is painful for humanity, for community, for the Jewish people, for our own families, for ourselves. When we go through darkness, it cannot be just to get to the other side and get over the darkness. We have to be enriched. It has to have some kind of long-term impact on our lives that makes us bigger and better than we ever were before. Here we were redeeming elements of holiness, lying buried in the bowels of the earth, of the physical, of the corruption of Egypt. And when we left, we took it with us, symbolized by the physical world. We took the holiness that was buried, latent, even in the Egyptian culture, and we used that to serve Hashem. That is fulfilling our purpose as Jewish people, to encounter the world, to deal with the world, and to find how we can utilize that world for a higher purpose. That's the reason our neshamas came down into this world. I want to talk now about the poster that we made. We said it's brand new beginnings, and obviously it's a portion that deals with beginnings because this is the beginning of Am Yisrael free. In this week's portion, we leave Egypt. But in this whole story, as we mentioned in the summary, right in the middle of this last final moments of exile, and we're about to be freed, Hashem says, I want to give you the first mitzvah of the Jewish people. Until now, there's never ever been a mitzvah for our Jewish people, this newly born Jewish people, the first mitzvah. What is it? To count time and to establish the Jewish year, which is based on the lunar cycle. So just to go through the various possibilities in counting time, throughout history, people have used various things around them to determine the advent of time and the end of time or period of time. So the counting of 12 hours in a day is pretty arbitrary. Somebody could have made it 10 and somebody could have made it 6. But the counting of time by the sun, that's not just like a human decision, let's just make it 365 days. That was saying that when the sun goes through the entire cycle of all the phases and goes through all, and the planets and the sun are in exactly the same position, it's 365 days later. So people who celebrate a year of a solar calendar count time by virtue of how long the sun takes for its entire cycle, which is 365 days. In Egypt, they counted time by something that had nothing to do with the sun and nothing to do with the moon. They counted time by the flooding of the river Nile, because that brought so much blessing to them. They, as we said, they never depended on rain. So they were able to celebrate when the Nile went into flood. And that was their method of counting time. In all cultures and all societies have had different methods. There were people who counted time by the moon. Now the moon has a cycle of 29 and a half days. So people could have said there's 10 months in a year or 15 months or 5 months, because there's no event that happens in the world relating to the moon every 12 months. The Jewish calendar is very unique in that it includes both the lunar and the solar cycles, and they have to be kept in sync. Why? Because if we only counted the lunar cycles and we decided, for example, that there's 12 months in a year based on the moon, 12 times 29 and a half gives you 354. I didn't work that out now, but that's in my mind, my brain from when I did work it out. So what you actually have is a discrepancy of 11 days, 12 times the lunar month, which is 354, and the solar cycle, which is 365, 11 days difference. And if you let that carry on, after 2 years, it would be 22 days. And after 3 years, it would be 33 days. And after 10 years, it would be, right? We just carry on moving and moving. And the Jewish calendar has to keep certain festivals, like the 15th of Nisan, Pesach, has to fall in the spring. Now, if you didn't do something to correlate the lunar and the solar cycles and calendars, you would end up having Pesach in the spring, and then eventually it would be in the summer, and then eventually it would be in the autumn, and then it would be in the middle of winter. Because the 11 days discrepancy would add up more and more and more, and therefore the Jewish calendar included the pronouncement approximately every 3 years, not every 3 years, but because it's 11 days, every 3 years there's a 33-day discrepancy, and so we add a Jewish month. Instead of having 12 months that year, we have 13, which is the case this last year. So therefore, everything is very late now because we had an extra month of Adar. But not exactly every 3 years because it's 33 days, so we have to compensate backwards. So it's a certain amount of almost multiples of 3. That is how to keep our Jewish calendar in place. And these two beginnings, Tishrei, which represents the advent of the world, and Nisan, which represents the advent of our people Israel being emancipated from slavery, the birth of Am Yisrael, are two beginnings of time. In our calendar, we say Rosh Hashanah is the beginning of the year. That's Rosh Hashanah, Tishrei, 6 months before Pesach. But that was the case up until the Exodus. As soon as the Exodus happened and Hashem gave us this mitzvah to count time, this was a brand new beginning, the beginning of time, all over again. And from now on, when it says the first month or the 6th month or the 5th month, it was counted from Nisan, from the liberation that took place at Pesach. So somehow the events that unfold in our liberation supersede creation itself. Creation is celebrated by Rosh Hashanah, but the relationship between Am Yisrael and the people, Israel and Hashem, and the birth of Am Yisrael becomes the new beginning. And this new beginning becomes so important that it actually overshadows the beginning of creation itself. Why? Because creation does not necessarily guarantee a life that is moral, that is appropriate, that is living for values. It was only when, because look what happened to the world. The world descended from bad to worse, from killing in the very first generation, and as time went by, it got worse and worse. Abraham was busy reminding people there was a God, but eventually the rock bottom of human society was Egypt, where human beings said, for my benefit, I'll enslave another human being. That was a perversion of what this world was intended to be. Kind, gentle, understanding, seeing the problems of others and responding to them. Now suddenly utilizing other human beings as slaves, that was rock bottom. Hashem said, I need a new beginning. And I ask you, my people, to begin counting time. The first mitzvah was the Kiddush HaChodesh, blessing the new month, Rosh Chodesh. And Rosh Chodesh, symbolically, is the moment that the moon is in the smallest phase. It is just a slither, a tiny little glimmer of light. But what was emerging now was the growth of light, the development of light, reflecting light that was going to come. And that was this new beginning of time that was to be counted by the Jewish people. And this mitzvah led to counting time so that we would know when Rosh Chodesh Nisan was. Then we'd count 10 days. That's when we brought the Paschal offering. And on the 15th day, we went free on Pesach. In between the first day and the 15th day, we had the 10th day. That's when we took the lamb, which, remember, was the deity of Egypt, Aries. This is the month of Aries, the month of Pesach. And it is the object of Egyptian worship. They worshipped the lamb. And the Jewish people were told to take the God of Egypt and demonstratively in their face, without any fear, stand up for our God of Israel and say, this supposed God, this evil culture is over. And the fact that we had that Mesirut Nefesh, that self-sacrifice, to be putting ourselves aside in Egypt still, taking their God and sacrificing their God, was the trigger that enabled us to be redeemed by Hashem, because we were worthy. We had given that self-sacrifice to live by the word of Hashem. And that, all of this ties up into this new mitzvah of counting time, brand new beginnings. And in fact, in life, we all have the beginning of life, which is when we're born. And then we have a second beginning, which is when we become bar and bat mitzvah, which is when we have the fullness of our neshama given to us. And that's the birthday of responsibility, accountability, living for things higher. The purpose and meaning of our mission. It brings us to 8 o'clock. I don't want to end with the lights already out. Happy load shedding. I hope everyone can keep smiling even when the lights go out. We should still not be blind to the needs of others, even when there's darkness around us. Have a beautiful Shabbos. Thank you for joining. I'm going to put it onto YouTube and send it out. God bless.
Thank you, Rabbi. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Keep it muted.